This unsuspecting square of grass in the Sinnoh region is probably the most unusual habitat in the entire Pokemon series. It is home to a possible 22 different unique encounters spanning a huge variety of types and backgrounds, and then ultimately covering a whopping total of 44 different Pokédex entries through evolutions and breeding, absolutely dwarfing what is normal for the typical Pokemon location by a huge margin. Now, it would stand to reason that this unprecedented level of biodiversity would imply something magnificent, something beautiful, borderline fantastical even, about this ecosystem and its associated environmental pressures. Which is, yeah, simply the case, obviously, but it's also just the tip of this strange iceberg. What exactly is going on here to explain this phenomenon? Welcome to the Trophy Garden. Coming out of Pokemon Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum, the garden can be found behind the Backlot mansion on Route 212, just south of Hearthome City. It's the pride and joy of the mansion's owner, Mr. Backlot, who is over the moon with the quality and variety of beautiful creatures that have made their home in this modest garden. It's something he brags about quite often, in fact. There are some rare, and I mean actually rare, Pokemon in the context of Gen 4 in the Sinnoh region that are living in this enclosure, and he is just jonesing to let people know. But that's where the trouble begins, I fear, because at the time of this reporting, none of these rare Pokemon can actually be found in the garden. Its sole inhabitants being the relatively common Kricketune, Staravia, Roselia, Pikachu, and Pichu. And while those 5 are definitely relevant players, we're gonna have to circle back to them because Mr. Backlot is frankly up to no good. Upon bragging to the player about a rare Pokemon found out back, in this moment, let's say it's Minun, Backlot's butler will nervously interject that that Pokemon is not found in the garden. And after a quiet, whisper-filled spat between the two, the butler runs off to do something, and Backlot assures you that he is absolutely no liar. Which is interesting, because now there are Minun in the garden, so I suppose he wasn't lying, technically. But what exactly is happening here? How and why is there now a population of creatures native to the Hoenn region living in this backyard? This is not explicitly not a mechanical video. There are some parts of that minutia that we have to get into, but I'm really concerned with the environmental and biological ramifications of this system Mr. Backlot seems to have in place. What we can probably say the most easily, and what is the borderline obvious part of this, is that the butler is somehow shipping these Pokemon in, and is doing so the very moment that Backlot tells one of his lies to the player. But beyond that, things start to get shifty. So I want to organize this analysis into a series of subcategories where we can best connect the dots. First is the matter of the Pokemon themselves. Where are they coming from, and how are they being acquired? There are 17 distinct Pokemon that Backlot describes as inhabitants of his garden, and all of them will need to be traced to an original habitat alongside a means for their delivery. Next is the matter of the trophy garden itself. How is the butler able to move the Pokemon in so quickly, and what can be nailed down about the physical operation that Backlot is running here? And then finally, the results of this horrible mess. What happens to these poor creatures after this charlatan has them shipped in purely for bragging rights and he no longer has any use for them? It is my expert opinion that these sub-questions hold the keys to understanding this absolutely bizarre environment. And so without further ado, let's get right down to business. Lock in, folks, for it's the latest and greatest Pokemon investigation as we dissect the strangest habitat in all of Pokemon. To start off here, we're going to be looking at that first big point in the Pokemon themselves. There's 17 distinct little guy populations being shipped in on various days, and while it is a pretty unique bunch of Pokemon, there are a handful of commonalities we can assign to the group as a whole. They all definitely live up to the trophy descriptor, which I know, very astute analysis, but it's a very particular idea of a trophy that says a lot about Backlot's sensibilities and even a bit about the Pokemon world. All of the Pokemon in this group have at least something of a mascot status within the series, but further seem to have been picked for being both exciting, yet relatively inconsequential. Out of this 17, there's no Pokemon that's outrageously powerful, and there's very little type variety. It's mostly all endearing little normal types, and the few that break this rule, like Marill or Bonsly or Plusle, lack the capacity or temperament to make a real mess of things. It almost makes me think that this lineup is something like a snapshot of the pedigreed pets of this world. Like, these are your purebred pugs or ragdoll cats of the Pokemon culture. And I think that grouping makes the selection process here much more obvious. These Pokemon are easy bragging rights because they're cute and well known, but more importantly, they're easy to obtain and manage if you have copious amounts of money like Backlot does. Because think about what Pokemon aren't here, for instance. He isn't claiming that there's starters back here, those tend to require more technical access than usual. And then same thing with babies like Magby, Elekid, or Tyrogue. They're probably a bit too cantankerous to be worth the trouble. Even something as obvious as Togepi, who seems right at home with this group, is probably considered too much of a liability to be brought into the garden. You know, Metronome's a pretty volatile move. So it would fully seem that these 17 were picked fully because they are low-hanging fruit, easily controlled, and they sound designer and opulent when a rich man is bragging about having them on the property. It's pretty disgusting stuff. But it does make the selection process a lot more clear for our investigation. They're all easy pickings if you have plenty of money to spare. And Mr. Backlot does. There are definitely some things in this world that money can't buy though, so it would seem that Backlot is very tactically targeting this specific group. And while he certainly might have a preference for some of them, this group is his easiest way to look good in front of strangers, and I really don't think it's his cast of personal favorites. It's just the business of looking pretty. And when we ultimately find the creatures in the trophy garden, we as trainers are exposed to what at least appears like fully wild, catchable populations, not individual Pokemon that someone else went out and caught themselves. So it further stands to reason that these 17 were wrangled en masse through means much more industrial than the average trainer would have access to. But where exactly are the Pokemon coming from? And then further, does this assessment of the selection process actually hold up? That's right folks, we're gonna actually hit the bricks and get to work on making a map of the encounters. First, and probably simplest, there are local Chansey, Bonsly, and Mime Jr. populations right around the corner from the garden on Route 209, making these three just a quick trip down the road. So they're going to be extremely easy catches given the circumstances. The same kind of goes for Meryl, who is literally right outside in Platinum, but a bit more complicated in Diamond and Pearl, where it's only found in the Great Marsh. I admittedly do have a lot of difficulty with squaring away version differences like this when I'm applying my particular lens of analysis. You know, we want to keep things as real as possible. And so while Meryl's whereabouts are a tiny bit shady, I at least don't think this particular difference matters much given the proximity to both locations and how absolutely loaded Backlot is. This is a guy with a mansion, a park, a garden, an entire staff working for him, and this is a mouse with a pool floaty for a tail. So unfortunately, I fear the writing is on the wall. Next we've got the Pokemon found on the Kanto and Johto mainland. Meowth, Jigglypuff, and Ditto are all common sights across the entire continent. While Clefairy is a fair bit rarer than the rest of them, it has unfortunately already been the subject of a trafficking campaign at the hands of Team Rocket. And given the level of financial access, it really seems like Backlot is up to something similar. Then from Hoenn, Plusle and Minun exist in huge quantities on Route 110 and can be easily rounded up, no problem. And so all of these Pokemon demonstrate that trait that we were suspecting. They can be easily found and then taken advantage of by your more unsavory parties. This leaves several baby Pokemon that can only be obtained by breeding. And I feel like we're getting into the territory of pretty dark implications with that, but I would be lying if I said I didn't have my own giant collection of reject hatches from trying to get a shiny Farfetch'd a few years ago. So look, it happens to the best of us. At least I always have something to wonder trade. But so a similar case is probably true in the garden for Igglybuff, Cleffa, Happiny, and maybe Azurill too, who was a Great Marsh resident in Diamond and Pearl only. So there is probably some breeding operation going on at and or around the mansion grounds that allows for this group to be easy garden residents. And then finally, we have the unusual cases of Porygon, Eevee, and Castform, Pokemon with no known wild location before this sighting at the Trophy Garden. It's this quality that, in my opinion, makes them the most telling aspect of this initial stage. Simply put, Backlot has broken the prior known rules of nature with this selection. Up until this point, all three of them could be considered special Pokemon in some way, and were only available as gifts at facilities or from individuals. Porygon and Castform especially are both artificial Pokemon being synthesized in the Kanto and Hoenn region respectively, so they're probably just being straight up purchased in whatever quality Backlot needs. It's specific proof that there must be a financial element to this whole ordeal because these Pokemon ultimately function in some ways as products. They were both science experiments and not part of any naturally occurring ecosystem, so this is the most pertinent example that there is likely no traditional capturing occurring here. Without the use of more financial means that are almost assuredly bordering on trafficking, these two being found in the garden would be actually biologically impossible and not just unlikely or difficult like the others. And then Eevee, as of the release of Gen 4, didn't really have a concrete point of origin at all. FireRed and LeafGreen listed in the Pokédex as an urban Pokemon, and that's really the only clue that we get as to its natural whereabouts. Certain characters like Bill seem to have an affinity for them, and they're definitely creatures of nature, just very rare. Yellow's Pokédex even states that there's only a few alive. So I guess from a certain perspective, Eevee's inclusion at the garden could be like a preservation initiative, I suppose. But my attention is unfortunately brought to the Gold and Silver Game Corner, selling them as prizes. So I'm inclined to actually believe that this is just another trafficking initiative, albeit a slightly more complicated one than the ones before. And that is the full 17. With the full map now complete and thought given to each choice, we can easily see the simplicity in each of these species. Out in the open, low complexity populations that would come easy to an estate with this much financial power. The complete setup does ultimately require international travel and transport, but the specific point of complexity is the cost, and not any of the other bells and whistles typically associated with rare Pokemon. We're not talking about Spiritomb, or Keldeo, or even Dinkeldar here. This is a spread of show ponies that act as a display of leisure and require very little technical ability in actual practice. So with that assessment in place, we can use it as a baseline as we move on to the next big question. How does the garden actually work? This is the question that initially sent me on this investigation, and everyone I talked about it with who had some understanding of the situation was primarily interested in this component and its specific core. How does the butler get the Pokemon into the garden so quickly? First, there's no Pokemon of the day in the garden, but then the butler rushes off as soon as Mr. Backlot whispers some unknown command to him, and then by the time you can actually make it to the backyard, the population of the day is just spawning in. Exactly like he said it would be. That's the complete story in-game. So obviously the issue in investigating, and one of the main reasons I've dragged my heels on this specific topic for a while now, is the ambiguity of the situation. This is a ridiculous phenomenon to explain with such little information, even within the fantastical world of Pokemon. So rather than veering into complete fan theory territory, I want to stick to what we do know and some relevant possibilities that go with them rather than trying to completely call a shot for the answer. My mind first wanders to the thought of the physical where the Pokemon are coming from. It might be holes in the ground, some sort of Minecraft situation, or some sort of door or garage attached to the side of the house. Really, whatever Mr. Backlot wants is fine because of what we know about how storage works in the Pokemon world. Most commonly available is the Pokemon Storage Network, and it's freely available to access at every Pokemon Center PC around the world. The system is available to digitize caught Pokemon and store them as data that can easily be deposited or withdrawn electronically, and this is very basic infrastructure for this world. So I almost automatically assume that the garden Pokemon are being held digitally in some manner in mass amounts before being released by species into the actual enclosure. This level of organization would be very easy to orchestrate even with the most basic PC tools available to trainers. So there's essentially no problem there. I do not think this is the whole story though, however. It's a bit sloppy to fully explain this away with the PC system for a number of reasons. We're ultimately encountering these Pokemon as wild, big air quotes there, and they can then be caught and given our own trainer ID, whatever you decide to make it. But for that reason, Backlot couldn't be using the PC as we know it to store the populations. The system requires ownership for Pokemon to be managed, and in addition to this, there is no in-world mass release function, and the creatures would have to be sent out one by one. None of which is to say that he couldn't have some sort of modified personal system that incorporates that original digitization component, and so I think it would be constructive to again look at the other big traffickers in the business with the Team Rocket Game Corner back in Celadon. Because while the delivery method is entirely different, you can buy the Pokemon as prizes once you've got enough coins, so the actual logic is remarkably similar. There's a seemingly infinite supply of a handful of different species being distributed from these prize counters, and upon obtaining one, the Pokemon is given your trainer ID. And these Pokemon are also strongly implied to have been rounded up in mass as a part of Team Rocket's scheme. Then given the amount of physical space behind these game counters, there's virtually no way to run this without some form of a custom digital system. And so then the only real difference between this and the garden is that the Pokemon are moved into a controlled physical space rather than directly into a trainer's hands. And the garden is this very controlled, portioned off area of the property. So this management would be super simple. As we've established, the Pokemon could be digitally contained in mass quantities without a proper owner and just organized by species. And this additional step would be as simple as the press of a button, just just like the game corner. This infrastructure could easily live in one of the 2 blocked off rooms on the property, but it's really anyone's guess where the butler goes after rushing out of the room. As long as it's somewhere nearby, it meets this criteria. This system would only require a handful of tiles of space, max, to release and manage the populations too. But also like the system seemingly in place at the game corner, the nature of this transaction makes it a one-way ticket, and I would presume that the Pokemon are either caught by trainers or naturally disperse after a certain point and are not necessarily rounded back up by mansion staff, because ultimately, this is just a display of wealth. It is really unfortunate that in order for Backlot to be able to show off as desired, he drops these sweet angels into a seemingly unregulated ecosystem with no purpose other than just looking pretty. It's certainly possible that the Pokemon themselves are being sold or perform some financial function, but with the small amount of dialogue and information we get in regards to Backlot as an individual, it really seems as though he's already taken care of and is just further stroking an already massive ego, because everything else will sort itself out as long as he can say there are pretty little fake creatures running around in his backyard. But yeah, to not split hairs, I would say it ultimately does boil down to a trafficking operation, even if one that's ultimately fruitless in classical terms. It does seem to be a very focused initiative though, with the staff needing intimate knowledge of Backlot's desired type of Pokemon and the resultant availability of the selected 17. He only ever picks out of that pool, and Pokemon can repeat on subsequent days. So once the initial framework was established regarding his lying ways and what he's specifically into, this system probably began moving like clockwork once all the Pokemon were set up. Which finally takes us to our last pressing issue with this situation. With everything said about how this small environment works and is populated, what happens now? Mechanically speaking, once a Pokemon has been inserted into the garden, it will stay there until 2 others have been slotted in. And while this slotting can only occur once per day, a Pokemon can be held indefinitely as long as Backlot isn't interacted with again. But this functionality is incredibly ambiguous as to what happens to the Pokemon when the slot rotates. One moment they're there, and the next they're gone. There's no set time period. I originally thought that the presence of such dangerous predators as the regular inhabitants spelled doom for the injected Pokemon. They honestly probably do. A Pokemon like Staravia is the equivalent of the Hat Man for babies like Igglybuff or Cleffa, but they are able to indefinitely coexist until a new claim is made. It probably still isn't pleasant though, so I am a little bit worried. But for better or worse, these Pokemon can all survive in the same space without complete hell breaking loose. But seeing as they do become wild Pokemon, they would either have to be rounded back up all over again to be put back in digital containment, or get chased off when it's time for a new Pokemon. And I don't really have enough evidence to answer that question. Either way, the bottom line is they're suffering. That's like the one really concrete takeaway I have from all of this, honestly. If the Pokemon get recaptured, then this garden is like a purgatory for the populations, only knowing a continuous loop of their own digital prison and the occasional experience of a distorted freedom in the actual garden, hoping that someday a trainer will come along and end their pathetic misery. And if there's actually some sort of capacity in place that just forces the Pokemon out, most are ending up far from home in an unfamiliar environment and without the tools or protection needed to take care of themselves. These are baby Pokemon, artificial Pokemon, and just overall incredibly vulnerable populations. None of them deserve the ecological disaster that is Mr. Backlot's trophy garden. No creature should be subjected to these conditions for the sake of one man's overblown yet shallow vanity. And like obviously, this location is an incredible resource in the context of the gameplay, and I have no serious intention of taking away from that at all. But within the lens of the investigation, it kind of seems like this garden is one of the most twisted and deranged operations in the entire Pokemon universe, and Backlot has a lot of questions to answer for. There is the tiniest silver lining that it seems like catching the rotating spawns is probably saving them from eternal suffering, so working on your Pokédex here is probably a genuinely good thing. But overall, when we roll over all the details like this and really peer deeply into them, there's not too much good to grasp at. Backlot seems to be just a terrible person. It just goes to show that the Trophy Garden is easily one of the most unusual, but more importantly, disastrous environments in all of Pokemon. And thus concludes another wondrous and harrowing Pokemon investigation. Yeah, sorry, that one was definitely a bit of a bummer. Not the usual tone of these, I promise. But I found it to be a cool look. It's something maybe a bit outside the usual comfort zone for these Pokemon analyses, and so hopefully you did too. Thanks a load if you made it this far, and I really hope you're able to enjoy it. From the origins of its inhabitants to the actual workings of its mechanical systems, we've hopefully left no remaining questions about the complexities of the trophy garden. But hey, don't let me stop you. Let me know in the comments if there's anything you think I missed, any theories or speculations of your own, and any other thoughts you had on the video. Give it a like and subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed it, because that's all I got for you this time. As always, thanks for watching. I'm surrounded by beauty. Droomish out.